in the sunlit town of Rosewood, lived 12-year-old Aaron, a boy with more toys than friends, and a habit of keeping everyone at arm's length. His house at the end of Maple Lane was bright and big, but inside it felt hollow and very quiet. Aaron had learned to get whatever he wanted. A new toy, a faster bike, the best seat in the class. But he rarely shared, and almost never asked how others felt. He watched kids play but kept his curtains closed, telling himself independence was proud, and loneliness was nothing to fuss over. Still, sometimes at dusk he would press his forehead to the glass and pretend the laughter outside belonged to someone else. One muddy afternoon, while thunder grumbled in the distance, Aaron noticed movement beneath the park bench. It was a small, trembling dog with eyes, too trusting for its own good. Aaron frowned and cranked the window shut, annoyed that the sight had disturbed his quiet. He told himself it was not his problem, but his hand hovered at the latch longer than usual. That night, he could not sleep, thinking about the dog's eyes, as if they were a question he had not answered. The next morning, curiosity proved stronger than indifference, and he stepped outside with a slice of bread tucked in his pocket. The dog was waiting exactly where he would seen it, tail wagging, coat matted, but greeting him with the same gentle trust as before. Aaron dropped the bread and felt something thaw inside him, an unfamiliar tug that felt almost like the beginning of friendship. At first, Aaron tried to keep his distance, calling the dog Worm or Mutt when neighborhood kids asked, but secretly he looked forward to those small morning visits. He started calling the dog Buddy out of habit, though he would never admit he loved that name. Buddy always came when called, tumbling over with clumsy affection that made other children giggle, and despite himself, made Aaron's chest warm. Week by week, small habits changed. Aaron tucked leftovers in his pocket for Buddy, and would wash mud from his fur with slow, patient motions. The boy began to talk aloud, telling Buddy things he had not told another person in years. Neighbors noticed the change. Mrs. Patel said the boy's laughter sounded different, more open when he walked with the dog by his side. But some children were cruel, teasing Buddy and shaking their heads at Aaron. At first, Aaron snapped at the taunts, shouting that Buddy was not his problem and that he did not care what others said. Yet when Buddy slunk away, ears low and eyes puzzled, Aaron felt a sharp regret like a pebble in his shoe. That afternoon, Aaron tried to act proud, pretending he had no time for the stray. But his meals tasted like cardboard, and every corner of the house reminded him of the empty spot where Buddy's head would usually have been. The next morning, the dog did not appear. The gate stayed stubbornly empty, and time stretched thin like pulled taffy. Aaron's apologies fluttered on his tongue, as small and useless as paper boats in a storm. He put on his sneakers and walked through Rosewood, calling Buddy's name until his voice was hoarse. The town felt different without that quick patter of paws at his heels. Days passed. Aaron left notes at the shelter, asked shopkeepers, and watched car mirrors for a glimpse of fur. Nights became long examinations of what he had lost. Then one busy afternoon, while crossing Maple Lane with his head down, Aaron almost stepped into danger. A car rounded the corner faster than it should have. A blur of brown fur shot forward and slammed into him, pushing him back just in time. Buddy had returned and thrown himself between Aaron and the oncoming danger. Aaron's knees bled, and his heart thundered with a strange ache. He scooped the dog into his arms, ignoring the scolding bystanders, and felt for the first time what it meant to be afraid of losing someone else. They rushed Buddy to the vet. His front paw was badly bruised, but the vet reassured them he would heal with time and rest. Aaron stayed by Buddy's side, whispering apologies and promises he would keep. That night, Aaron sat on the linoleum, head on his knees, and told Buddy stories about a boy who did not know how to ask for help. The dog listened with soft eyes, as if he already understood the language of regret and forgiveness. Recovery was slow, but every day Aaron sat with him, fed him, cleaned his wounds, and learned to be patient in ways he would never been before. Where once he had raced for toys, now he made lists of small deeds for Buddy. Neighbors who had once mocked now nodded with gentle respect, seeing the boy who had become a quiet guardian for a dog who trusted him completely. Aaron felt his own shape-shifting. Generosity crept into the edges of his life, where selfishness had lived. At school, he stopped scoffing at other children's small pains and began to share his snacks without counting them. Little by little, friendships found him because his heart, once packed away, had begun to open. A month later, Buddy could run again. The bruise had faded and his step regained its cheerful rhythm. Aaron and Buddy became an inseparable pair, walking the lanes, finding secret spots, and inventing silly games that made neighbors smile. But kindness sometimes meets old habits. One summer afternoon, Aaron found himself hoarding a coveted comic book, refusing to lend it to a friend. The boy's old reflexes surfaced and shadowed the new light he would work so hard to nurture. Buddy nudged his hand and looked up with patient eyes, as if asking, "Is this really worth it?" The simple question was enough. Aaron opened his palm, slid the comic over, and felt a warm, honest joy bloom at the sharing. Word spread about the boy who had changed and the dog who had taught him, and soon the idea of kindness became contagious in Rosewood. Children organized small acts of care around the town. Aaron learned to listen first and speak kinder. He learned that caring did not make him small, but rather it made him larger in ways he could feel in his chest. Buddy, with a tilt of his head and a wag, was the quiet teacher behind every new lesson. One rainy afternoon, Aaron found a small, lost kitten shivering at the bakery steps, and without hesitation scooped it up and brought it home. He had once been the sort of boy who would step around trouble, but now he moved toward it like someone answering a call. The shelter noticed Aaron's quiet devotion and invited him to volunteer on weekends. Aaron's schedule filled with purpose instead of hollow toys, and the town's smallest hearts warmed under his watch. His parents, noticing the change, slowed down and sat with him more, listening to the stories of his days and laughing at his small dramas. The family dinners grew longer, and Aaron realized that the space he had once filled with trophies would always be better filled with shared memories. Months melted into seasons, and Buddy aged gently by Aaron's side, his muzzle graying at the edges and his naps growing longer. Aaron learned to be grateful for every sunrise and to celebrate the quiet moments that had once bored him. One crisp morning, a new neighbor arrived with a little girl who reminded Aaron of his younger self, shy, clutching a worn teddy, eyes wide and uncertain. She watched Buddy at first from a distance, longing for courage to approach. Aaron led her over, kneeling down to greet her and offering Buddy's paw as a safe bridge to friendship. The girl laughed as Buddy sniffed her hand, and Aaron felt that familiar warmth, the joy of helping another brave the world. Sometimes the smallest decision becomes the biggest kindness. Aaron decided to teach the girl to draw and to show her secret spots in the park, making a new friend as he kept giving back. It felt like healing in slow motion. As Buddy grew older, Aaron began to worry about the day when the dog might not be there anymore, a fear he finally learned to name and feel openly, instead of stuffing away. He promised himself he would repay everything Buddy had given him with as much love as the dog had offered. One winter morning, Buddy failed to bounce out of bed the way he used to. He moved more slowly and blinked as if some light inside him had dimmed. Aaron sat beside him for hours, whispering stories and singing the little tunes the dog seemed to like. The town noticed and closed in around them with kindness. Neighbors brought warm blankets, soup, and soft words. Aaron felt the circle of care return to them, and with it a deep gratitude so wide it almost hurt. During long evenings they sat watching the stars together, while Buddy rested his head in Aaron's lap. The boy learned that love sometimes means sitting quietly and being present. One spring afternoon, Buddy's breathing grew faint and slow, and Aaron felt time compress into a single sharp point of grief and gratitude. He held the dog close and whispered all the things he had learned. Buddy slipped away quietly, surrounded by the family and neighbors who had come like a small, warm tide to say goodbye. The town that had once sneered at a stray now remembered with gentle smiles and soft tears the joy he had given them. Aaron's grief was honest and loud at first, a storm of missing, but slowly it changed into something steadier, a soft reservoir of memory he could draw on when days felt empty. He planted a little rose bush where Buddy liked to nap. He began volunteering more, teaching children to care for animals and telling them Buddy's story, not as a tale of sadness, but as a lesson in the strength of love. The shelter found homes for more dogs because one neighborhood learned to look with kinder eyes. Years later, Aaron grew into a young man whose hands were steady and generous, who fixed an old clock as easily as he fixed a broken toy for a child in need. The town now knew him for kindness, for the gentle patience he would learn from a dog with trust in his heart. Sometimes strangers would ask, "How did you change so much?" And Aaron would point at the rose bush and say simply, "On someone taught me to care." He never stopped thinking of Buddy. On the little plaque by the bush he had written, "Buddy, who taught a boy to give his heart away." It was small and honest, just like the life they had shared. People read it and paused, then smiled, a small ripple of goodness spreading. Aaron kept a small cupboard of Buddy's things. The worn collar, the dented bowl, a faded photograph of them on a summer day. When times were hard, he would take out the collar, run his fingers over it, and remember that he would been given a second chance. Neighbors who had once mocked the boy now told their children his story at bedtime, teaching a new generation the meaning of kindness. The change became a living thing in Rosewood. Years rolled gently on. Aaron learned to open his hands and his heart without fear, because he would seen how much gentleness could heal. He married a kind woman who loved animals, and together they welcomed a house full of rescued pets and laughter. On quiet mornings, he would sit by the rosebush and tell the new children stories of Buddy's stubborn bravery, the way he would barged into a life that needed him most. Those tales were not sad, but full of warmth, a celebration of humble heroism. Sometimes people asked if Buddy had been special because he was a dog, but Aaron shook his head and said, "No, he was special because he chose us. He kept coming back, and that is the bravest thing of all." On the anniversary of Buddy's passing, the town would gather by the park and leave treats and small notes, not to mourn, but to remember how one small soul had changed many. It became a quiet festival of care that made Rosewood brighter every year. Children grew up hearing the lesson: generosity does not cost much, but it returns in ways you cannot imagine. A nibble of kindness is the start of an entire forest. Aaron sometimes found himself at the shelter on stormy nights, rescuing another trembling animal, and his hands no longer trembled with fear but with purpose. He had learned to be a harbor for those who drifted, because he remembered being adrift once. In quiet moments, he would trace Buddy's name on the plaque and smile at the memory of sloppy kisses and muddy paw prints that had once cluttered his floor. Those small traces were the map of a life that led him from selfishness to belonging. People said the boy had grown into a gentle man, not because of one heroic act, but because he practiced being kind every day. The boy who once shut his curtains now opened his doors and shared what he had. Years later, when Aaron carried the scent of old dog hair on his sweater, he would chuckle and say it was the proudest badge he would ever worn. The badge meant he had lived his lesson, and someone somewhere would learn from his story too. Every spring the rosebush bloomed a little brighter, and people whispered that Buddy was there in the color and the smell. Aaron would stand, close his eyes, and pretend he could feel that familiar nudge at his leg. And though years folded into one another, the lessons stayed. Patience, the joy of giving, and the courage to be tender were now part of the town's quiet language. Children learned to say please and thank you with weight, and the park felt softer because of it. On a late evening once, walking home from the shelter, Aaron paused by the rosebush and felt a soft breeze brush his face that smelled faintly like old dog fur and sunshine. He smiled, like someone who has been given a second name for himself. Friend. He pressed a small hand to the plaque and whispered, "Thank you, Buddy," and the night answered with the chirp of crickets and a soft, unseen comfort. Some connections never break. They only change shape and become stories told to warm other hearts.